Hello, my name is Ocean. My story. It starts with betrayal, a family's silence, and the weight of being sold for the price of a debt. My father muttered coldly, "The debt is done." And in that moment, I became nothing more than a pawn in a game I never agreed to play. The villagers? They whispered I was cursed, a witch to be forgotten. But they never imagined I'd return. They never saw me coming back with what was rightfully mine. The question is, can I rebuild my life from the ashes, or will the ghosts of my past haunt me forever? The truth they buried. What if it's all been a lie? Stick around, and I'll show you just how deep the deception runs, just how far I'm willing to go to get what I deserve. I stood frozen at the edge of the dirt driveway, staring at the hunter's cart. The wooden wheels creaked under the weight of the thick air that hung between us. My father and I. Vernon, my father, always a man of few words, stood a few paces away, his back to me, as if there was something on the horizon he was afraid to face. I watched as Dorian, the hunter, loaded up the last of his gear, an old rifle, a bundle of dried meat, a pouch of herbs. He didn't look at me, didn't offer a word of comfort or even acknowledgement. It was as if I wasn't even there, just another thing to be carted off, like the game he hunted, to be discarded once its usefulness had been exhausted. "Get in," Vernon muttered, his voice cold. But there was something underneath it, something heavier, as though he could feel the weight of the debt pressing down on him. "The debt is done." It wasn't the first time I'd heard those words, but this time, the finality in them made my stomach churn. A debt was a debt, something that could be paid off. But who would pay for me? For what was left of me? What would I become after this? The answers to those questions slid down my spine like an icy chill, leaving me numb. I didn't speak. There was no point. The words, the protests, all of them had been worn down over the years. I had learned the hard way that when you're a daughter, when you're the youngest, when you're the one who's been pushed aside for every mistake, there are no words left to say. "Pack nothing," he ordered. I didn't even look at him when he said it. There was nothing I needed, no belongings left to take, nothing I could claim as my own. As my mother stood by the door, her eyes hollow, her hands wringing the hem of her apron, she only managed a small, defeated gesture, placing the scarf I wore every day over my shoulder. No hug, no kiss, no word of comfort. I didn't expect any. The cart was waiting. The wheels spun slowly in the dust, a testament to the years it had carried burden after burden. I climbed aboard, the seat creaking under my weight. Dorian didn't say anything as the cart lurched forward. I kept my gaze fixed on the road ahead, on the red brick church that stood like a monument to something I could no longer reach. I had grown up here, surrounded by this tight-knit town, where everyone knew everyone's business. As the cart moved, the village square came into view. The sound of the wheels against the gravel echoed through the air, a constant reminder of what was happening. I could feel the eyes of the villagers on me, even if I didn't look at them. They didn't need to say anything. Their glances said it all. Some of them whispered under their breath, as if they were trying to hide their words behind the creak of the cart. "She's cursed," one of them muttered. I recognized the voice, Miss Marigold, the baker's wife. Another spit on the ground, her face twisted in a scowl. "That girl's a witch." My hands trembled, but I forced myself to keep them still, my palms pressed flat against the edge of the cart. There was no use in showing anything, no use in crying, no use in defending myself. I was already marked. I had always been marked. I swallowed the lump in my throat, not trusting myself to speak. The years of being dismissed, being ignored, of watching my family fall apart under the weight of their own failures, had led to this moment. They had paid their debts, but at what cost? The cart rolled on. The town blurred as we passed. Children peeked out from behind their mothers, eyes wide with curiosity and pity. I couldn't even bring myself to look at them. I was no longer the girl who once played in these streets, running around with Callista, laughing in the warm summer air. I had lost that girl a long time ago. The cart veered to the left, off the main road, heading towards the woods. I could hear the crunch of gravel turning into the soft thud of the forest floor. Trees began to close in around us, the green of the leaves swallowing the sun's light, casting everything into a shadow. I felt the wind catch my scarf, pulling it free from my shoulders. It fluttered in the air for a moment before being whisked away by the wind. I didn't chase it. No one did. Dorian kept his gaze forward, his grip tight on the reins. He didn't say anything as we moved deeper into the forest. The sounds of the village disappeared. All that remained was the creak of the cart, the rustle of the trees, and the quiet hum of my thoughts. It was in that moment that I realized I was no longer a daughter. I was no longer a sister. I was simply a transaction, something bought and sold, something that had no value except in the debts it could settle. The forest closed in around me, and I couldn't help but feel that the trees were swallowing me whole, erasing me from everything I had known, from everything I had once been. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. The girl who ran through these streets, the girl who once had dreams of something more, was gone. And as the cart moved deeper into the woods, I understood that my name had already disappeared. Just like my scarf, it had been lost in the wind. The trees were thick and heavy with shadows, casting a blanket of silence over the world as we moved further into the woods. Dorian had led the cart to a place so isolated that I couldn't even see the stars above. Everything was a blur. Darkness, the rustling of leaves, the sound of the cart's wheels grinding against the uneven ground. When the cart finally stopped, Dorian didn't speak. There was no "we're here" or "get out." He simply stopped the horses, tied them to a post, and walked away into the dense trees, the creaking of his boots barely audible over the stillness. I stared at the cabin in front of me. It was small and dilapidated, its wooden walls cracked and faded, its roof sagging. There was no warmth in the structure, no invitation to comfort. It looked like a place built to keep the world at bay, a place to hide, to be forgotten. It wasn't a home, it couldn't be. Homes were meant to have love in them, but all I felt in that moment was the cold wind and the overwhelming silence that wrapped around me like chains. "Get inside," Dorian said from the doorway, his voice low, emotionless. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders. There was no kindness in his voice, no hint of compassion. He was as cold as the place I had been dragged to. I walked inside. The smell hit me instantly. Old smoke, blood, and something else, something more metallic, like death itself had seeped into the walls. The fire in the hearth was barely smoldering, the light from it casting long, crooked shadows on the walls. The floor was dusty, covered in old footprints, some fresh, others long since forgotten. The only furniture was a worn-out wooden chair and a small table, both seeming to sink into the floor as if even the cabin itself was being swallowed by time. A sign hung above the door. "Property," it read. I thought at first it was just a nameplate, but then I realized, no, it wasn't a name. It was ownership. It wasn't a home. It was a prison. "Sleep there." Dorian gestured to the corner of the room where a thin mattress lay, covered in a threadbare blanket. He turned on his heel and left as quickly as he had entered. That night, as I sat on the edge of the mattress, the cold seeped through me like the smell of the cabin, slow, steady, and unforgiving. I couldn't even bring myself to lie down. The mattress felt like it had been there forever, as though the very fabric of it had been woven with resignation and defeat. I heard the door close behind Dorian, but the sound didn't bring relief. No, it only added to the weight, the sense of isolation. I could hear him outside, muttering to himself in low tones, and then the snap of twigs as he disappeared further into the woods. I didn't move. I stayed sitting there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, the same wind that had carried me away from everything I knew, from everything I once was. The silence of the night stretched on, long and endless. I could feel the hours tick by, each one taking a little bit more of me with it. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there when I finally heard him again, but the smell of alcohol carried through the air long before I saw him. He entered the cabin, heavy steps pounding against the floorboards, and then the door slammed shut behind him. "Get up," Dorian grunted, throwing something on the table. "We eat." I stood slowly, my legs aching from the cold, and made my way to the table. He had thrown a piece of stale bread on it, nothing more. My stomach growled, but I didn't eat, not yet. I looked around the room. There were no windows, no way to tell what time it was. The only thing that marked the passage of time was the sound of Dorian's heavy breathing, the occasional clink of his empty bottle being set down. I tried not to look at him, tried not to feel the weight of his eyes on me as he stripped off his coat and hung it by the door. My hands shook slightly, but I held my gaze forward, pretending the space between us was empty, like it didn't exist. As I prepared the meager meal, Dorian sat in the corner, silently watching. I couldn't tell if he was judging me or simply waiting for me to break, but either way, I kept my mouth shut. There was no point in saying anything, no point in asking why I was here, why it had to be this way. It didn't matter. It never had. The silence stretched on until I finally placed the food in front of him. He looked at it for a moment, then downed a drink from his bottle before shoving the bread in his mouth. He didn't thank me. He didn't acknowledge me at all. I had learned, in the days leading up to this moment, that there was no such thing as gratitude here. There was only survival, and the quieter you were, the longer you lasted. The evening passed in a haze of nothingness. Dorian came and went, always silent, always distant. When he left the cabin before dawn, the smell of alcohol still lingering in the air, I was left alone again, sitting on the edge of the bed, listening to the howling wind and the rustling of the trees outside. It was on the second night that I first saw the sign. It was carved into the wood above the door. Property. But this time, the word hit me harder than before. It wasn't just a sign, it was a declaration, a reminder that I wasn't a person here. I was nothing. Nothing but an object to be owned. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just a girl who had been sold. I wasn't just a daughter who had been cast aside. I had been reduced to nothing, to property. It felt like my very identity was slipping through my fingers, like sand through a sieve, but I couldn't allow it, not yet. I couldn't let myself disappear into the cold of the forest, into the silence of this place. I had to hold on. I had to survive. I would never be owned. But as I stared at the sign above the door, I couldn't help but wonder, how long before I was? The pot slipped through my hands with a sickening crack, and for a moment, everything around me went still. The riverbank, the sound of the water rushing by, even the cool, damp air, it all blurred into a dull hum. The shattered pieces of the pot lay scattered across the rocks, their jagged edges catching the weak sunlight that filtered through the trees. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I couldn't. I had seen what happened when things broke here. I had seen how everything shattered into pieces, like the fragments of the pot, never to be put back together again. Dorian would notice. He would notice every broken thing. But this was different. This wasn't just any mistake. This was the one thing I wasn't allowed to break. The pot had been here longer than I had, longer than anyone. It was the only thing that had remained constant in this cold, lonely hut, the last relic of something resembling a home. I stood there, motionless, staring at the shards that seemed to mock me in their jagged beauty. My hands trembled from the cold, from the exhaustion, but most of all, from fear. Dorian was coming back soon, and when he saw what I had done, there would be no mercy. With careful movements, I knelt down and began to gather the pieces of the broken pot, trying to piece it together like some desperate puzzle. But I knew it was useless. There was no fixing this. Not this time. Not anymore. The thought of what Dorian would do made my stomach churn. I didn't dare look back toward the riverbank. Instead, I focused on the broken pieces of the pot in my hands, the sharp edges digging into my palms. The smell of the river, the dampness of the earth, all of it seemed to close in on me. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate. Dorian was back. I didn't move. I stayed crouched by the broken pot, the blood from my lip now mingling with the dirt on my hands. The pain wasn't much. It was the kind of pain I had gotten used to, the kind that never truly healed, the kind that became a part of you. But this was different. This was something that couldn't be ignored. Dorian's shadow loomed over me before he spoke. His voice was low, guttural. "What did you do?" he asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I knew better than to speak now. I had learned that lesson quickly enough. Words didn't matter. They only made things worse. He grabbed my arm roughly, yanking me to my feet. My knees scraped against the cold ground as I stood. I winced, but there was no time for that. The sting in my body was nothing compared to what was coming. Without a word, he slapped me, hard enough to make my vision blur, hard enough that I tasted blood in my mouth. I didn't make a sound. I couldn't. The sharpness of the pain exploded across my cheek, but I held it in. I didn't let him see how much it hurt. His grip on my arm tightened, and I could feel the muscles in his hand pulse with anger. I didn't dare look up at him. I kept my gaze fixed on the ground, on the shards of the broken pot. The silence between us was deafening, but it wasn't just the silence of this place. It was the silence of everything that had led to this moment. He didn't speak again. He just turned away, leaving me kneeling on the ground, my body trembling. The room felt colder now, emptier. I didn't move. I didn't even look up when I heard the door slam behind him. I stayed there on the floor, my hands still trembling, blood mixing with the dust beneath me. The silence in the hut was unbearable. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the very air was suffocating me. But still, I didn't move. I didn't clean up the mess. I didn't touch the broken pot. The pieces would remain where they were, scattered across the floor, like everything else in this life. That night, I lay awake in my corner of the hut. The same place I had slept since the day I arrived. The same corner that had seen me break down, seen me bleed, but never seen me fight back. I could feel the weight of Dorian's anger in the air, thick and suffocating. The slap still stung, but it wasn't the pain that kept me awake. It was the knowledge that nothing in this place would ever change. And I wasn't allowed to change. Not here, not with him. But there was something else. Something that had been gnawing at me ever since I stepped off that cart. Something that had been growing inside me, hidden beneath the layers of fear and silence. The scarf. It was the last piece of me, the last reminder of a life before this one. Before I was sold. Before I was nothing but property. I had kept it hidden beneath my mat, tucked away where no one could see it. But tonight, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I reached for the scarf, the soft fabric slipping through my fingers as I pulled it from beneath the mat. I held it tightly in my hands, pressing it to my chest, feeling its coolness against my skin. It wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was all I had left, the only thing that still felt like me. I remembered my mother's hands as she tied the scarf around my neck, the way her fingers lingered for a moment before letting go. She had never said anything, but the gesture had meant everything. It had meant that I was hers, that I belonged to someone. Now, it was just a piece of fabric, a relic of a life that was gone, but I wouldn't let it go. Not yet. I held the scarf until my hands stopped trembling. The silence in the hut was deafening, but it was nothing compared to the storm that was rising inside me. The next morning, when Dorian returned, I was waiting for him. I didn't speak, but I didn't need to. The silence was my answer. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't break. I made a vow in the quiet of the dark. I wouldn't be broken like that pot. I wouldn't stay shattered. I didn't take long to understand the dynamics of this place. Dorian had a way of speaking, of moving, that made it clear he didn't need to say much to be understood. The world around him operated on a set of unspoken rules. He gave the orders, and the rest of us, me, did the work. That afternoon, the familiar sound of Dorian's heavy boots broke through the silence of the hut. He returned with a cart full of supplies. It was a sight I had grown used to, a cart laden with meat, bread, fruits, items I had never seen much of before. They were the fruits of his so-called hunt, the spoils of a life I had no part in. He told the villagers about his great gift to them. He was proud of it in a way. It was like a performance, one where I wasn't even a backstage player. He spoke with a tone of superiority, like the hunter who had provided for the people, without ever once mentioning the labor that made it all possible. I stood in the background, as I always did, quietly observing the scene. He handed out the goods to the villagers, each item carefully chosen and presented as though it was all his doing. I could feel the weight of it, the way they all praised him, nodded in approval, all while ignoring the girl who had worked so hard to prepare the food. Not once did they look at me. I wasn't there. Not really. I was just the silent force behind his great gift. I didn't protest. I never did. What good would it do? This was his world, his rules. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes were empty. No thank you, no recognition. Just a dull nod and a few harsh words about my efficiency. He never truly acknowledged me. I was simply the means to his end. The villagers, as usual, didn't care to know my name. They knew me by the work I did, by the meals I prepared, but I wasn't a person to them. I was the faceless laborer who made sure they didn't go hungry. It wasn't just my name they had forgotten. It was me, my identity, who I was, erased by the simple power of their indifference. Every time I entered the market, they would look right past me. Dorian spoke for me, just as he spoke for everything. When I tried to ask a question or give a simple greeting, I was met with nothing but blank stares. They only looked to Dorian for answers. He was the one who had earned their respect, their trust, not me. That day, I found myself walking through the crowded market, feeling more invisible than ever before. The villagers were huddled around Dorian, asking about the meat he had brought, talking about how generous he was. But when I spoke, they looked through me. It was like I was a shadow. I wasn't even a person to them. Just a presence that drifted through their world unnoticed, unwanted. I walked to the merchants with my head down, carrying the goods for Dorian. I offered them with the same quiet grace I had learned to adopt, hiding behind my silence. The traders nodded, taking the items without so much as a glance at me. One merchant, a woman I recognized from the previous visits, caught sight of me and spoke. "You've prepared this well," she said, inspecting the meat I had carefully cleaned and seasoned. I nodded, but inside I felt a flicker of something. It wasn't much, a small ember of recognition. She didn't acknowledge me as Dorian's servant. She saw the work I had put in. It wasn't a lot, but for a brief moment I felt seen. She offered me a better deal than usual, a fair exchange. More than I had expected, more than I had hoped for. It wasn't much, but it was a small victory. I took the goods she offered, and for the first time, I allowed myself to smile. The transaction wasn't just about food or goods, it was about something more, dignity. But of course, that moment passed quickly. The second I turned around, I could already feel the weight of Dorian's eyes on me. His sharp gaze was like a warning. I didn't know what was worse, being invisible or being seen only through his eyes. I couldn't help but think, what does it mean to be seen when the one seeing you is the very one who doesn't even care to know your name? The walk back to the hut was long, and the silence between us was suffocating. I kept my head low, my thoughts swirling. I thought of the merchant's words, the brief moment where I wasn't just a shadow. I thought of the smile I had allowed myself. And then just as quickly, I thought of Dorian. He had seen me, and I knew he wasn't pleased. His hand slapped across the back of my head with such force that I stumbled forward, barely catching myself. "You don't get credit here," he muttered. His words hit harder than the slap itself, not because I was surprised, but because I had expected it. Every little victory I had, no matter how small, was never mine to keep. The world around me shifted in that moment, just slightly, but it was enough to remind me that I didn't belong here, that I would never belong to this place. The shame, the silence, it was all suffocating. But still, something had shifted inside me. For the first time, I didn't just take the slap. I didn't let it bury me. I walked back to the hut in silence, the weight of his words heavy in my chest. But as I walked, something in me hardened. The silence wasn't just mine anymore, and I would find a way to make it my own. I didn't expect it to be the silence that would set me free, but it was. Every day, I had lived in that silence, the same hollow quiet that hung between us like a thick fog. I had let the quiet settle over me, let it bind me into something smaller, quieter, until I was a shadow of myself, watching my life pass by in the haze of things I had no say in. But tonight, the quiet felt different. It didn't belong to me anymore. It was just another piece of the world that belonged to Dorian. That evening, after the slap and the humiliation, I sat by the fire. The flames flickered weakly, as if they too knew they were waiting for something to ignite. My hands, worn from work, rested on my lap as I stared into the dancing shadows cast by the flames. The light was warm against my skin, but my heart felt cold. My thoughts drifted to my mother. I could hear her voice in my mind, her quiet strength, the way she had always said that silence was never a sign of weakness. She'd said it so many times. We may not speak much, but when we do, it's always worth hearing. And I remembered how she would sit by the fire, not out of necessity, but out of the knowing that sometimes silence was the only tool that could carve the world into something worth living in. I wasn't sure when it started, but as I watched the fire grow stronger, I felt the first spark of something inside me. It wasn't just the heat from the fire. No, it was something deeper. A spark that burned for the years I had spent silent and unseen. For the years I had worked for Dorian, always in the background, always his shadow, never his equal. The silence was no longer something I would endure. It was something I would use. I knew I needed to do more than just sit here. I had to do something to mark this moment, something that would make it impossible to return to the way things had been. So quietly, I began building a rack for smoking meat. My hands moved with purpose, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, because for the first time, I was doing something for me. As the rack took shape, the fire beneath it blazed a little brighter. I didn't look up, but I felt it, felt the heat rise around me, just as the fire inside me began to burn brighter. I wasn't just cooking food anymore, I was preparing a rebellion. By the time Dorian returned, I had finished the rack. The air smelled of wood and smoke, a quiet promise of the work to come. He came in with a grunt, as usual, his boots heavy against the floorboards. He looked at me briefly before turning his attention to the cart he had brought back, filled with meat, supplies, and the faint smell of alcohol. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. He didn't acknowledge the rack I had made or the fire that had built in the hearth. He barely looked at me. But something was different. I could feel it. That tension between us, thick like the smoke curling around the room. He was still in control, but I was no longer content to be a passive observer of my own life. Later that night, after he had gone to bed, I sat on the edge of the mat where I slept, staring at the shadows on the wall. My fingers tightened around the scarf my mother had given me. It had been my only link to the past, the only thing that remained of the girl I had been. But tonight, it wasn't just a scarf. It was the last thread of my identity. My name. The girl who had belonged to someone, to a family that had once cared for her. It had been so long since I had felt like I was someone who mattered. But the silence. It was suffocating. I couldn't stay silent anymore. The next morning, I found something in the corner of the room, buried under a pile of old, discarded papers. It was a document, yellowed and brittle with age. I knew what it was the second I laid eyes on it. A contract. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, the cold edges pressing into my fingers. There it was, my name scrawled across the bottom, but it wasn't in my handwriting. I didn't remember signing it. In fact, I knew I hadn't. But my sister's signature was there, unmistakable. Callista. The contract had been signed under duress when I first arrived at this hut, but it didn't stop the betrayal from cutting deep. The document wasn't just about Dorian owning me. It was about my family, my own flesh and blood, signing away my future. The rights to anything I might inherit from my father's land, all given away with a simple flick of a pen. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip it apart, burn it. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was still too quiet, still too afraid. But that changed when I walked out into the village the next morning, carrying the meat I had worked to prepare. I passed by the market, the same faces staring back at me. They saw me, but they didn't see me. To them, I was just the girl who worked, who cooked, who existed in the shadows. But as I passed the stall where the merchant had given me that fair deal last week, something inside me clicked. I stopped. I didn't just hand over the goods and leave. I stayed. I stood in front of him, my gaze steady. The wind picked up, ruffling my hair. But I didn't flinch. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not today. The merchant looked up at me, his eyebrows raised in confusion. "Is there something else?" he asked. I shook my head, but my eyes told him everything. I wasn't the quiet girl anymore. I wasn't going to let this happen to me any longer. That evening, Dorian returned, his usual anger in tow. I knew he would notice. I knew what was coming. And as I prepared dinner, my hands steady, I thought of the contract. I thought of my family. I thought of Callista. I couldn't let them control me anymore. Not like this. Not anymore. And when Dorian saw the extra food I had kept, the meat I had sold for myself, he came for me. His hand raised in anger, but I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. "You don't get credit here," he spat. I held the contract up between us, my hand firm. "I'm not invisible anymore," I said. "And neither is my name." His eyes narrowed, but he didn't strike me. Not this time. I had seen something in his eyes, a flicker of hesitation. Later that night, I walked to the edge of the forest. It was dark, and the fire crackled loudly in the distance. I couldn't burn down the world I had been trapped in, but I could burn the contract. I could burn the piece of paper that had held me down for so long. I didn't need the ashes to speak. They spoke for themselves. And when I walked back to the hut, my hands cold from the wind and fire, I knew that this was just the beginning. The air around me was thick with uncertainty as I clutched the document in my hands. It wasn't the first time I had seen it. I had known it existed long before I laid eyes on it today. But this time, it felt different. The weight of the paper, stiff, cold, foreign, seemed to press down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Dorian didn't know I had found it. He wouldn't expect it, but I knew what it was, and I knew what I had to do. The village office was quiet, eerily so. I stood outside, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, the stale air greeting me like an old, forgotten memory. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Some semblance of order, maybe? A man behind the desk who would take me seriously? No, I knew better. The world I lived in had no use for someone like me. I was just another face, another shadow. "Can I help you?" The village notary, an older man with thin hair and a voice that barely carried, looked up from behind his desk. I had seen him once or twice before, but he wouldn't remember me. He wouldn't remember anyone like me. "I need to speak with you about a contract," I said, my voice steady. I didn't let the tremor in my hands show. I set the forged document on the desk in front of him, watching as his eyes flickered over the paper. His gaze hardened for a second before he masked it with the professionalism he had no doubt perfected over the years. "I'm afraid you're too late, miss," he said, glancing at me briefly. "The land has already been signed over. The deal is official." He leaned back in his chair, not a hint of concern in his eyes. I felt my blood boil, but I said nothing. There was no point in arguing with him. This was just another reminder that I was nothing but a name on a paper, a cog in a wheel that didn't care about the people it crushed. "I see," I said, my voice dangerously calm. I turned on my heel and walked out, my heart pounding in my chest. I had come here hoping for something, a shred of justice, but the only thing waiting for me was the bitter truth that nothing was going to change. As I walked back to the hut, the weight of the contract seemed to grow heavier in my hand. My fingers curled around it, crushing it like I was trying to destroy the very thing that had held me captive for so long. I wasn't done, not yet, but for the first time, I realized how much power I had given away. Dorian was waiting for me when I returned, as if he knew what I had been doing, as if he could sense the shift in the air. I could see the smirk on his face, the smugness in his eyes. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low and mocking. "You're nothing here. You always will be." His words stung, but I didn't let him see the effect they had on me. I had learned a long time ago that showing weakness only gave him more power. This time, it was different. He wasn't going to control me. Not anymore. I stood there, holding the contract in my hand, and I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just going to be his pawn anymore. I wasn't going to let him talk to me like that. I was done. "I'm not your property," I said, the words coming out stronger than I expected. "I never was." Dorian's expression faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. He laughed, dismissing my words as if they were nothing. "You think you can change things? You think you have power? You're just a fool, Ocean. His words didn't hurt anymore. They didn't have the same sting they once did. I wasn't that girl anymore. I wasn't the girl who stood silently, hoping for a change. I was the one who was going to make the change. That night, after Dorian had gone to bed, I stayed up. I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with plans, with ideas, with thoughts of how I could take control. The silence had been my prison for so long, but now it was my weapon. I needed a strategy, something more than just words, something that would make Dorian see me as more than just a servant. I couldn't let him take everything from me. Not my dignity, not my future. The next morning, I took the first step. I left the hut early, heading into the village again, but this time with a purpose. I had a plan. I had something Dorian couldn't take away from me. I went to the neighboring farms, asking around about buying back what was mine. I didn't know how I was going to do it, but I had to try. The farmers didn't look at me the same way they looked at Dorian. They didn't see the same threat. And slowly, over time, they began to take me seriously. I started selling the meat I had prepared. Slowly, I gained a reputation. People began to notice that the quality of the meat was better than anything they had gotten before. They came back for more, and word spread through the village. I was no longer just Dorian's silent worker. I had a name, and I was starting to build something on my own. But Dorian noticed. Of course he did. He wasn't blind. He could see what was happening, and it made him angry. I knew he would come for me. He always did. That evening, he caught me in the village, walking back to the hut after another successful trade. His eyes narrowed when he saw the bags of goods in my hands. His steps quickened as he approached, and I could feel the familiar surge of dread in my stomach. "You think you can just walk around like this?" Dorian said, his voice cold and threatening. "You think you can make a name for yourself without me? You're nothing, Ocean. You can't beat me." His words were a knife to the heart, but this time I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I had something now that he couldn't take. My voice was steady when I spoke. "I'm not your property," I repeated, "and I don't need you to survive." His eyes flashed with rage, but there was something else there too. Fear. He was scared. I could see it now, in the way his hands clenched into fists, in the way his jaw tightened. "You can't beat me," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. But for the first time, I didn't care. I wasn't scared of him anymore. I had already won. The world I had been trapped in was falling apart, and I was the one tearing it down. As he walked away, his words lingering in the air, I knew this was just the beginning. The fire I had started was still burning, and it wasn't going out. Not now, not ever. The weight of the paper in my hand felt like a stone in my chest as I stood in the village square. The villagers were milling around, paying no attention to me, just like always. They didn't know me, not really. They knew my work, the meat I prepared, but they never cared to ask my name. Today, that was going to change. Today, everything was going to change. I saw Dorian approaching from the corner of my eye. He was walking with his usual cocky stride, his shoulders squared as though he owned the whole town. And maybe, for a while, it felt like he did. But not anymore. Not today. I stepped forward, catching his gaze, and for the first time, I wasn't the invisible girl who was just there to do his bidding. I was someone who had a name, a history, and a story to tell. "You never got my signature," I said, my voice cold but steady, cutting through the bustle of the market. "That deal was never mine." Dorian paused mid-step, his expression shifting for just a moment, but he quickly masked it with a smirk. "You're just trying to stir up trouble, Ocean," he said dismissively, as if my words were nothing but idle threats. "It's paperwork, nothing more." But I didn't flinch. I didn't back down. The anger that had simmered inside me for so long surged to the surface. I was done hiding. I was done being silent. I pulled the contract from my bag, my fingers trembling only slightly, and slapped it down onto the dirt beneath our feet. The parchment cracked like thunder in the air, loud and undeniable. Dorian's eyes narrowed, and the smirk that had been playing on his lips disappeared. The villagers began to gather around, drawn by the commotion. They didn't know what was going on, but they could feel the tension rising in the air. They stared, waiting for something, anything to happen. Some of them recognized me, but few really saw me. Today, that would change. This was never your land, Dorian, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. It was mine, by right. You stole it. The crowd went quiet. I could see the whispers starting, confusion, disbelief. Dorian, for the first time in a long while, looked rattled. His usual confidence faltered. It's just paperwork, he repeated, his voice shaky, trying to convince himself more than anyone else, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew what I was saying was true. You're not going to get away with this, I said, my words sharp and final. This is fraud, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling through them. Some of the faces I saw were familiar, but I wasn't sure if they were looking at me with pity, curiosity, or something else. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that I had finally said it. I had taken the first step. I had started to fight back. Dorian's face went red with anger. His eyes flashed with something darker, something dangerous. I could see the veins in his neck bulging as he clenched his fists at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might lash out, but he didn't. Instead, he took a step toward me, his voice low and venomous. You think you can just walk away with what's mine? He spat, his words dripping with contempt. You'll never be safe. I'll make sure of that. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more uncertain. Some of them were beginning to turn their backs on him, their eyes filled with doubt. The power he had once commanded was slipping through his fingers like sand. I stood my ground, not moving an inch. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't let it show. I didn't flinch. I wasn't afraid anymore. The deal's over, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. You're nothing to me, Dorian. I've won. For the first time, Dorian didn't have a comeback. He didn't know what to say. The truth had come out, and it was too much for him to handle. He took a step back, his face contorting with rage and disbelief. He didn't know how to process this, how to deal with the fact that he had lost, but I wasn't done. Not yet. I turned to the villagers, my gaze sweeping over their faces. This land was never his to take, I said, my voice ringing with finality. It was mine, and I'm going to make sure it stays that way. The villagers watched me, some of them nodding in agreement, others still unsure. But there was a shift in the air, a change. For the first time, I was the one with the power. Dorian, however, wasn't finished. As I turned to leave, he called out to me, his voice thick with venom. This isn't over, Ocean, he threatened, his words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. You'll regret this. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I had finally made my stand, and nothing he said could take that away from me. As I walked away, I could feel the eyes of the villagers on me, their gazes heavy but full of something new, respect perhaps, or curiosity. For the first time, I wasn't just the girl who did the work. I was someone who had a name, someone who had power. The fire that had started in my heart burned brighter now. It wasn't just a flicker anymore. It was a blaze, and it was only going to grow stronger. The villagers had gathered. The air was thick with anticipation as the usual hum of the marketplace faded into an unsettling silence. Today was not like any other. Today I was standing in front of Dorian, ready to face the lies, the betrayal, and everything he had stolen from me. I could feel the weight of the forged contract in my pocket, the paper heavy with secrets and truth alike. As I walked through the square, the faces of the people around me flickered like shadows, unsure of what would happen. The tension hung between us, palpable and raw. Dorian stood across from me, his broad shoulders stiff, his usual smirk replaced by a look of disdain. He was trying to control the situation as always, but there was no room for him to hide today. You think you can just walk up here and make demands, Ocean? Dorian sneered. You've got nothing. Nothing but your stupid little rebellion. You don't know what you're dealing with. I stood tall, my chest rising and falling with steady breaths, the heat of anger simmering beneath the surface. The moment had come. You never got my signature, Dorian, I said, my voice cutting through the air. That deal was never mine. He laughed, but it was a hollow sound, forced. You're just trying to stir trouble, girl, he said, his eyes narrowing. It's all just paperwork to me. I didn't blink. The fire in my chest roared, and for the first time, I didn't feel small or invisible. I felt as if I was standing on solid ground. You're wrong, I retorted. You never had a right to anything here. It was always mine, by birth, by law. You stole from me, from my family. With a swift motion, I pulled the contract from my bag, the paper crinkling in my hands. I slapped it down onto the ground in front of him, hard enough for everyone to hear it. The sound reverberated in the space between us. A murmur spread through the crowd as Dorian's face turned red with anger. His usual bravado faltered for a moment. I knew I had caught him off guard, and it felt good. But I wasn't done. This contract is a lie, Dorian, I said, watching the villagers gather around, drawn by the tension in the air. It was forged by my sister. She signed it on my behalf. She stole from me, just like you did. Dorian's expression twisted, his lips curling into a sneer. You don't have a clue what you're talking about, he spat, but his voice lacked conviction. This is just paper. None of it matters. You're nobody, Ocean. I didn't back down. It matters because I matter. I'm not a ghost. I'm not some servant you can just control. This land was mine, and you're not going to get away with what you've done. The crowd shifted, the murmurs growing louder. Some of them started to turn away from Dorian. I could see it in their faces, doubt, regret, a flicker of understanding. They'd believed his lies for too long, but now the truth was staring them in the face. Dorian's eyes flashed with fury, but there was no more bravado left in him. He knew he was losing control. You think the villagers are going to turn on me just because of a piece of paper? He growled, stepping closer to me, his fists clenched at his sides. You're nothing, Ocean. You always have been, and you always will be. This is my land, my life. I won't let you take it from me. His words hit me, but they no longer held the same power they once did. I had already taken it back. I raised my chin, locking eyes with him. The deal is over. You've lost. The land is mine. For a moment, Dorian looked like he might strike me, but he hesitated. His anger boiled over, but there was something else behind it now. Fear. The fear of losing everything. I could feel the power shift. The villagers, once fearful of Dorian, were now watching him with something else in their eyes. Disgust. Uncertainty. Some even began to mutter in disbelief, their voices rising in support of my claim. Dorian turned away from me, his expression hardening. You think you've won? He spat, his voice thick with venom. You think this is over? You're wrong. You're going to regret this, Ocean. But it was too late for him. The power had shifted. The villagers were no longer afraid. They were no longer under his thumb. As Dorian walked away, I felt the weight of the moment sink in. The battle was far from over, but today, I had won. I stood there, my heart racing, but my shoulders squared. I was no longer the girl who had been pushed around. I was no longer the one hiding in the shadows. I had taken back my life, my land, and my dignity. But even as Dorian's form receded into the distance, I knew this was only the beginning. There would be more to fight for, more to prove. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to stand up for myself. I turned away from the square, the sound of the villagers' voices murmuring in the background. Their support, whether vocal or silent, felt like a new kind of strength coursing through me. And as I walked away from the crowd, I knew one thing for sure. I was done being silenced. The battle was over, but I knew the war for my future was just beginning. The villagers, once divided between fear and obedience, now turned their eyes on me. My name, Ocean, no longer carried the weight of a curse or a whisper of scandal. It was spoken with respect, if not admiration. Walking through the village square, I could feel the change in the air, a change that I had fought for. The market, once a place where I was invisible, now buzzed with a quiet recognition. People no longer avoided eye contact, nor did they whisper behind my back. I had carved out a space for myself here, one that I would defend with every breath in my lungs. I passed the merchant who had once ignored me, his eyes now meeting mine with a nod. He had learned that the girl who had been overlooked could now hold her ground. The strength I had fought to reclaim was becoming known, not through words, but through action. The wind stirred through the leaves of the trees, a reminder of the days when I had walked this path alone, unsure of my own worth. The road had been long, filled with moments of doubt, pain, and betrayal, but now I was not just a survivor. And I was someone who had rebuilt, from the ground up, the life I had been forced to leave behind. As I made my way to the edge of the village, where the river ran thick with memories, I felt the familiar weight of the past settling on my shoulders. But this time, it wasn't a burden. It was part of who I was. I had buried the girl who had been sold and forgotten in the woods. Now, I stood tall, the woman who had come back stronger, unbroken. The river, once a place where I had scrubbed the remnants of my brokenness, now felt like a place of reflection. I stopped by the water's edge and knelt, watching the current rush by. My fingers brushed the cool surface, and for a moment, I felt the presence of my past self. The girl who had been afraid, the girl who had allowed others to define her. But that girl was gone. The fire that had burned in me was no longer just a spark. It was an inferno, one that would not be extinguished. I had reclaimed what was rightfully mine, the land, my voice, my dignity, and I would protect it. I stood up, feeling the weight of my decision to let the past remain in the past. There were still remnants of it, pieces of the forged contract buried in the soil, my mother's scarf tucked away in my room, but they no longer held sway over me. The land beneath my feet felt different now. It was mine, not just in name, but in spirit. But as much as I had gained, there was still something missing. I hadn't yet faced my father, the man who had sold me, the man who had stood by as my life was torn apart. I had avoided him, knowing that the encounter would be inevitable, and knowing I wasn't ready to face the man who had betrayed me. But now, I was ready. I walked toward Dorian's cabin, the familiar path taking me past the woods that had once trapped me, past the place where I had been abandoned. This time, the woods didn't feel threatening. They felt like the backdrop to my transformation. I found my father sitting by the door of his cabin, his face drawn and tired. He didn't look up as I approached, and for a moment I thought of turning back. But I didn't. I had come too far to turn back now. "Father," I said, my voice steady, but carrying the weight of everything I had been through. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in weeks. There was a flicker of recognition, of regret, but it was fleeting. "Ocean," he said, his voice rough, worn down by time. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just trying to survive, trying to make things right in my own way. I could see the shame in his eyes, but it wasn't enough. I didn't need his apology. I had learned to stand on my own. "You can't undo it," I said quietly. "You can't take back what you did. But I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I'm here to tell you that I've moved on. And I'm never going back to the person I was before." He didn't answer, but his gaze softened. I could see the regret, but it didn't change anything. I had forgiven him, not for him, but for me. I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of the land beneath my feet. It was mine now, and I was free. Back in the village, I stood before the council office, a quiet confidence flowing through me. The decision had been made, and I was finally in control. No longer the girl sold to the highest bidder, no longer the daughter who was cast aside. I was Ocean, and my name echoed in the streets, in the hearts of those who had once whispered it with disdain. I stood tall as I walked past the market, the familiar faces now greeting me with respect. I had fought for my place here, and I had earned it. And as I looked ahead, I knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but I was ready for it. The sun began to set, casting a golden light over the land. I stood at the edge of the village, watching the horizon stretch out before me. For the first time, I felt at peace. The winds carried my name, and I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. My name is Ocean. I was sold, but now I am free. And that was the truth. The truth that would echo in the hearts of those who had once doubted me. The truth that would carry me into the future, one step at a time. As we reach the end of this story, Remember that silence doesn't equate to weakness, and injustice doesn't have the final say. Ocean's journey shows us that no matter how much we are pushed down, we always have the power to rise, reclaim our truth, and redefine our futures. What do you think about the choices Ocean made? Can revenge truly set us free, or does it keep us trapped? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories like this one. Stay tuned for the next chapter of strength, survival, and redemption.